Annual Armenian Genocide Memorial Lecture today. I want to thank Professor Mustafa Minawi and Lori Hachadurian for this invitation, and the Department of Near Eastern Studies, Mario Inadi, Center for International Studies, Critical Ottoman and Post-Ottoman Studies as well. And I want to thank each of you for joining us this evening, either in person or virtually. Today, I designed my lecture to talk about the immediate aftermath of the Armenian genocide and the First World War. But to talk about the immediate aftermath of Armenian genocide and post-genocide period, we should first talk about Armenian genocide of 1915, because it is impossible, to discuss immediate post-genocide period without, first talking about the Armenian genocide of 1915. But rather than historic explanations of 1915, I just want to take a moment to start with a personal story which explains what people on the ground actually suffered in 1915. Because I believe that human suffering is often neglected when we talk about crimes against humanity. Thanks to the publications of historians in the last 2 decades, now we know the general framework of Armenian genocide and the historical developments that happened during 1915. But what people suffered on the ground was oftentimes neglected by the historians. So I will start with a less academic way and by telling a story of an Armenian survivor that I recently discovered. Okay, so yeah. So this is a village in Sivas in central Anatolia, where Armenians were living with Muslims in 1915. In 1915, when the Armenians of this village were deported, my great-grandfather escaped to the mountains, leaving his 3 daughters and wife behind, because he saw that the Armenian men were rounded up and taken to different locations where they were killed. He escaped. He left his 3 daughters and wife behind. He hid in the mountains and valleys in that area for a while, until a Circassian Aha, a landlord, caught him while actually he was trying to steal some fruit and fruit and vegetables from this Circassian Aha's orchard. So this Circassian Aha took my great-grandfather in his house, gave a Turkish name. He was Turkified, he was forced to accept Islam for a while. But until the end of the First World War in 1918, he was able to return to his village. He escaped from Circassian Aha's house. And of course, when he got back to his village in Sivas, all the Armenian families were gone. They were disappeared. All of his friends and extended family members. So he never heard about the fate of his wife and 3 daughters. We also never heard about, as a family, about the fate of his wife and daughters. He married again and built a family again in this village until 1960s in Turkey. And they moved to Istanbul, and they completely, relocated to Istanbul in 1960s. When I visited this village in 2013, an elderly woman dressed in her traditional Alevi clothes approached to me and asked, "Who are you, young man?" When she heard that I was an Armenian and my great-grandfather was from that village, she was saddened. She whispered to my ears, "They did terrible things to you. They did terrible things." Then she started to talk about things that she heard from her father, from her family. And it surprised me how the memory was still alive among these people in these remote villages where Armenians were once lived, together with Turks and Kurds and other ethnic groups. Even though it is mostly absent in historiographies, neglected suffering of people on the ground survives actually in oral tradition. Inspired by this trip to Sivas in 2013, I decided to do research on the fate of post-genocide Armenian community in the Ottoman Empire and modern Turkey. When I read the existent historiography on the Armenian genocide, I realized that the majority of scholarly written works focus only on 1915, and the Armistice period, that is from 1918 to 1923, only occupy a few paragraphs or short sections of scholarly written books. Only a few scholars, such as Lernek Mikçoğlu, provided space for this very critical period in which an empire collapsed and the nation states emerged in the Middle East. I chose another neglected source material, the Armenian and Turkish newspapers, to understand this historic period, to understand the political motivations of the Armenian community during the Armistice years. I borrow and utilize the theory of ethnic bargaining from the political science literature. In the recent literature of ethnic politics, Erin Jenny has argued that minority groups may be radicalized by the signals of behavioral intent from the host state or from a third state. Accordingly, if the host state demonstrates an aggressive approach towards an ethnic minority group, the radicalization of that group is more likely. Furthermore, if there is an intervention by a third state on behalf of the ethnic minorities' rights, the possibility of the radicalization of the group further increases. I will further explain how I utilize this theory in my research in the subsequent sections of this talk. I want to very briefly provide also official, historical explanation of 1915. During the wartime, through the spring and summer of 1915, in all areas of the Ottoman state, including cities far from conflict zones, the Ottoman government at that time orchestrated the deportation. Convoys of civilians, including women, elderly, and children, were marched hundreds of miles without food, shelter, and proper clothing. The Armenian men were conscripted into the Ottoman army and were worked to death in the labor battalions. While the government claimed that Armenians were being deported from the areas close to the Russian border, Armenians living in the Marmara region and Thrace, about 1,000 miles away from the Russian border, were also deported. The Armenian intellectuals in Istanbul were arrested and sent to isolated prisons in central Anatolia, where most of them were killed. After the Armistice of Mudros was signed in 1918, an atmosphere of insecurity still permeated the Ottoman state, and the Armenian community was still suffering from the collective trauma experienced. Of course, the end of the First World War was catastrophic, both for Muslims and for non-Muslims. From the beginning of Balkan Wars in 1912 to the end of the First World War in 1918, the demographic composition of cities stretching from the shores of Albania to the shores of Lake Van was violently altered by means of evacuations, forced removals, mass violence, and the post-war Erzurum of 1922 bore very little resemblance of its pre-war self. Likewise, the city of Bitlis, which historically included a vibrant Armenian population, emerged as a ghost town after 1915. According to the estimates, the population of Anatolia declined by 25% during the wartime. It is at this juncture that this lecture focuses on to shed light on the experiences of the Armenian community in the final dying years of the Ottoman Empire. I focus on the political reactions of post-genocide Armenian community at a time when the idea of self-determination was an important topic on the agenda of international community. As Erez Manela puts in his book, it was a Wilsonian moment for the nations suppressed under these imperial and colonial regimes. In my analysis, I focus on specific political indicators to trace how the majority of Armenians pursued a common agenda to achieve common political goals, and also to demonstrate that the immediate post-genocide Armenian community was so active and vibrant, even though the genocidal trauma was so fresh. So I want to continue my presentation by highlighting a turning point at the end of the First World War. Then I will move on elaborating Armistice period, which started in October 1918. During the first months of 1918, the Turkish intellectuals published articles promoting the idea of Ottomanism, this umbrella identity of being, citizens of the Ottoman Empire, regardless of, religious and ethnic background of people. What Ottomanism meant for the Turkish intellectuals, this term developed over the course of 19th and 20th centuries, and it came to be understood as the equality of all citizens living in the Ottoman Empire. So this political idea re-emerged, particularly in the last months of 1918, when the approaching ultimate defeat of the Ottoman Empire by the Allied powers was certain. So while Turkish intellectuals again called for uniting all ethnic groups under the idea of this umbrella identity of Ottomanism, because the fall of the state was becoming increasingly clear, and the Turkish intellectuals were cultivating fears of occupation and the possible dismemberment of the state because of its non-Muslim populations, particularly Armenians and Greeks. So the Ottoman Turkish, in general, Ottoman Muslim society was convinced after the Balkan Wars in 1913 and the major clashes during the First World War in 1915 that the nucleus of the Turkish land must remain united, and any possible partition of this core would cause displacement of Muslims in Asia Minor. This belief is evident in the reflections of Ottoman Muslims toward the establishment of Armenian state in the Caucasus. So when the Armenian state in the Caucasus, the tiny Armenian state, the first Republic of Armenia in 1918, established in May 1918, the Turks welcomed and recognized this state simply because it was established outside of this nucleus of Turkish lands. The Ottoman Empire actually was the first state officially recognizing this newly established Armenian state in the Caucasus in 1918. So it's in that sense, it's very interesting. After only 3 years, the Ottoman Empire was the first state recognizing Republic of Armenia, and they also sent some aid to Republic of Armenia in 1918. So Vakit Daily, the Times Daily, an Ottoman Turkish newspaper published in Istanbul, they proposed actually that the Ottoman government provide assistance to this newly established Armenian state, as in turn would serve a dual purpose. By providing basic assistance to Armenian state, the Ottoman government could help establish a stable structure on its eastern border and block the ambitions of Armenians to unite with their compatriots in the Caucasus. So the Vakit Daily wrote, I quote, "There is an Armenian nation that, if its needs for independence is not satisfied, will not stop causing havoc and will not abstain from doing anything. The main target of this anger will be us. The only way to free the Armenian nation from such an irresponsible situation is to make them landlords. If they become landlords, they will stop political riots and engage in trade and agriculture." So this was in 1918, before the signing of Armistice of Mudros. So in response to the publications of the Turkish press in Istanbul, Armenian intellectuals at that time started to write about the Armenian-Turkish rapprochement or friendship. So this was in 1918, before the signing of Armistice of Mudros. For example, Vercin Nur, the latest news, one of the perhaps most popular newspaper at that time among the Armenian community, responded to these publications. I quote, "We enthusiastically shake the brotherly hand that they extend to us. Being the children of the same country, the Turk and Armenian are forever equal and together. Both would live happy. We greet with gladness this brotherly cordial expression." So this was, it was wartime, still wartime, and this was perhaps a tactical move by the Armenian political elite not to, cause more risk given the political climate. So in the political field, in practical terms, the Ottoman Empire was essentially surrounded when Bulgaria signed a separate ceasefire agreement with the Allied powers in September 1918. When Talat Pasha, Grand Vizier and one of the leaders of the CUP, was on a visit to Berlin in 1918, he learned the heavy German defeats on the Western Front. He tried to offer a joint peace statement, agreement to the Allied powers, but he couldn't succeed. Returning from Germany, Talat Pasha witnessed the disintegration of the Bulgarian army, and Bulgarian leaders met him at the train station to inform him about their separate peace agreement. When he heard news of the Bulgarian ceasefire, he stopped and stared a moment, mumbling a Turkish phrase, "Şimdi boku yedik," we are in deep shit. Indeed, Talat Pasha has reason to be concerned. While the CUP government had fought for a German victory during the First World War, not only had it faced internal resistance from opposition groups, but also Allied powers urged the CUP, Committee on Union and Progress, on several issues, including the Armenian genocide, which they declared a crime against humanity and civilization. Bulgaria was very important. It was a bridge linking the Ottoman capital to Berlin, and it was a linchpin in the transportation scheme of both military and financial assets. So basically, when Bulgaria signed this ceasefire agreement, that meant also the surrender of the Ottoman Empire in 1918. So the Ottoman economy, on the other hand, was on the brink of collapse. The public debt in 1914 was approximately 171 million Turkish liras, but by 1918, it had increased threefold. Food shortages led to famine, not only in provinces, but also in capital, Istanbul. In 1918, prices rose 25-fold, and it was an enormous increase in inflation. Under these circumstances, the CUP government, they resigned, and the newly established Ottoman government signed the Armistice of Mudros, and it was the surrender of the Ottoman Empire in October 1918. So what happened with the signing of Armistice of Mudros in October 1918? So following the removal of CUP government, as I mentioned a few minutes before, Armenian intellectuals were writing about, publishing articles about this Turkish-Armenian friendship, being the brothers of the same country. But now things started to change after the signing of Armistice of Mudros. So they regarded the fall of the government as a bright light appearing at the end of tunnel, and Ottoman Turkish intellectuals, they also started to publish articles criticizing CUP, Committee of Union and Progress. On the very day of signing of Armistice of Mudros, the elation was evident in the Armenian community. For example, Verchin Nur Daily, the latest news, one of the most popular Armenian newspapers published in Istanbul at that time, announced the armistice with a heading, "The whole capital celebrates and goes into raptures," and the lead article titled, "Today's enthusiasm, flags of Entente fly splendidly," opened with a passage which reflected the significant change in Armenian political stance. Christos Harial Ilmeralos, Christ is risen from the dead. It is noteworthy here to point out, as I mentioned a few minutes before, a few months before signing of Armistice of Mudros, the same newspapers were publishing articles and news about Armenian-Turkish friendship. The flags of Greece, Italy, France, and Britain were flying on the streets of Pera in Istanbul, with Christians greeting each other, "Christ is risen from the dead, blessed is the resurrection of Christ." According to an Armenian correspondent, the streets were full of people crying with joy. The Armistice of Mudros perceived as a salvation for Armenians. They were technically still the citizens of the Ottoman Empire at that time. So the Armistice opened a new stage in the history of Armenians. The publications of the Armenian press reflected a reaction from the Armenian community, which had been suppressed during the wartime. approach of the Armenians drastically changed with the signing of Armistice of Mudros. For the first time in centuries, the idea of coexistence was officially diminished. For the majority of Armenians, it was time to pursue a separate path. What is important here for our discussion is the political position of Armenians changed from this pro-Turkish to pro-independence, pro-allied in a very short period of time. It is impressive how this change took place only in a few months. The most important factor in this change is the beginning of Allied occupation, as you can see on this image on the right. This is the main street, avenue in Para, in Istanbul, and you can see the flags of, Greece and other Allied powers, flags of other, Allied powers at that time. And these are occupational forces who occupied Istanbul. What's important for our discussion is the political position of Armenians changed from pro-Turkish to pro-Allied. In the case of Armenians, the political position of the community rapidly changed from pro-Ottoman to pro-independence within just 3 months. The ideas of self-determination began to be published in Armenian dailies because the capital was occupied by the Allied troops. I think it was the first time that Armenians, not even in 1915, published such articles about creating an independent state, the idea of self-determination. Perhaps it's the first time in the Armenian history in the Ottoman Armenian history that Armenians published such articles. It was in 1918. So I suggest that the Armenians were radicalized and galvanized following the de facto occupation of Ottoman lands by the Allied states, which openly declared their support in favor of Armenian independence. Meanwhile, what happened to the Ottoman Muslim side was that the Siyupi leaders, Talat, Enver, and Cemal, they escaped from Istanbul in November 1918. Here I want to briefly provide some examples about what Ottoman Turkish intellectuals wrote at that time. I think it's important that it shows us some insights. For example, Halide Edip, one of the prominent Turkish intellectuals at that time, she discussed about the Armenian genocide of 1915, and she published articles about 1915. So I quote, to ingratiate the Turkishness, so to say, we carried out a campaign to annihilate the Christian population, particularly the Armenians, by medieval methods. As a responsible nation, the whole burden is put on our shoulders because of the atrocities that went on for years. Now these have been dark and hopeless days for our nation, and the worst thing that saddens us is that United States and Britain see us as a state that killed her own innocent population, including their children, and oppressed them. So the discussion about the Armenian genocide of 1915 actually took place in the capital in 1918, 1919. Ottoman Turkish intellectuals, they wrote and published many articles discussing about the Armenian genocide of 1915. Of course, they didn't use the word genocide because it was, as you know, coined after the 1940s. Most of the time they wrote, Qiyam or Qtal, meaning Armenian massacre. So what I'm trying to say is that the denial of Armenian genocide of 1915 actually emerged after the foundation of Turkish Republic in 1923. At that time, during the Armistice period, Ottoman Turkish intellectuals openly discussed about the Armenian genocide of 1915. Even the newspaper of Minber newspaper, one of his stakeholders was Mustafa Kemal. They also published articles about the Armenian massacre and about Turkish-Armenian relations. So, as you may know, Wilsonian principles was a very important topic at that time. Woodrow Wilson, the 28th President of the United States, formulated the 14 points, a document that outlined the peace terms of the United States for the resolution of the First World War. The points were based on the principle of self-determination of the national minorities who were oppressed by empires and undemocratic states. Soon, the Wilson principles became an important concern for Turks, Greeks, Armenians, and other ethnic groups living in the Ottoman Empire. For example, in December 1918, Turkish intellectuals, they organized Society for Wilsonian Principles, Wilson Prensipleri Cemiyeti, and also they organized another Society for the National Defense of Rights of Eastern Provinces. As you can see, they were trying to block the foundation, the establishment of an Armenian state in Eastern Anatolia at that time. So what about Armenians, the Ottoman Armenians? At the same time, the Ottoman Armenians' public attention was focused on the developments of Armenian delegation in Paris. The Paris Peace Conference opened in January 1919 with the participation of the victorious states to discuss the peace terms which were to be imposed to the Central Powers. So two Armenian delegations were assigned to give voice to the Armenian demands, one representing the Ottoman Armenians and the other representing Armenian state established in the Caucasus. But before opening the conference in December 1918, the Armenian delegation in Paris actually established the cabinet of United Armenia, Miatsial Hayastan, the idea of Miatsial Hayastan at that time. So United Armenia's border were intended to include Cilicia, 6 Armenian provinces in the Ottoman Empire, and the lands of Armenian Republic in the Caucasus. Whispers of establishment of a cabinet for United Armenia were already making their way to the columns of Armenian dailies published in the Ottoman capital. It is relevant to our discussion here that Armenian dailies, be they liberal or nationalist, reflected this enthusiasm and mobilization for the Armenian community. The pro-independence position of the Armenian community increased significantly when the Allied powers signaled their strong support. As it has been argued in ethnic bargaining scholarship, there is a strong possibility that when there is an external support, the radicalization of a group is likely to increase. The ethnic bargaining theory comprises two crucial components: external support and the radicalization of the group. In the case of Armenians, we see the external support shown by the Allied powers, and we see that the Armenian community radicalized by this external support. So the increasing support of the Ottoman Armenian community in Boğaz-Nubar, for example, represent a crucial point for our theoretical framework, because Boğaz-Nubar was a highly respected community leader and an activist who devoted himself to the cause of establishing an Armenian state in the eastern provinces of the Ottoman Empire, also known as Vilayat-ı 6 provinces. The increasing support Boğaz-Nubar received from various strata of the community, including intellectuals, community leaders, and common folk with no political affiliations, is indicative of gradual radicalization of the community and wider mobilization around the idea of Armenian independence. The Ottoman Armenians not only expressed their support for Boğaz-Nubar, but they even celebrated a day in honor of him. They celebrated Feast of Boğaz-Nubar to show their gratitude and respect to this political leader at that time. For example, Norgyak Daily published an article, I quote, "It is the feast of Armenian George Washington today. Come, let us make a toast for him. Come, our Greek brothers, yet another cup with you. It is the feast of Armenian Venizelos today." As you may know, Venizelos was the prime minister of Greece at that time. Another indicator for the pro-Armenian, pro-independence approach of the community was the support of Armenians' donation campaigns organized for the Armenian state in the Caucasus. So Armenians organized donation campaigns to help Armenian refugees in the newly established Republic of Armenia in the Caucasus. Indeed, the prospect of famine was grave in the Republic of Armenia at that time. According to reports, there were more than 500,000 Armenians, Ottoman Armenians, refugees in the Republic of Armenia, living in poverty and danger of famine. Even in the capital, Yerevan, approximately 150 people died each day from hunger and typhus. And in the second largest city, Gümrük, the rate was 100 people per day. In total, 1,000 people died each day within the borders of newly established Republic of Armenia. And reports stated that there were not enough doctors, there was a shortage of medicine, and people were reduced to collecting dead animals in streets for fuel. And Georgia and Azerbaijan closed the borders, so it was a very challenging period at that time for the Republic of Armenia in 1918. Another indicator of this political position that I benefit from is the Vartanants feasts that the Armenians celebrate. And I trace in newspapers that how the community members actually celebrated this Vartanants feast at that time. For example, in February 1919, more than 800 native Armenians from Afyon, a small town in Western Anatolia, gathered at the hall of Armenian school to celebrate this Vartanants feast. British military officers were present at the gathering. A prominent member of the community urged the crowd to migrate to Miatsial Hayastan, United Armenia. So they tried to convince the Armenian survivors who were living in western parts of Anatolia to migrate and populate this soon to be established the United Armenian state. But we will see that it was not possible for the Armenians to convince allied powers at that time. During this event, another interesting indicator was that Armenians, they used their own flags, Armenian Republic of Armenia's flags. And of course, there were British flags. And the event, according to the correspondent that published this article in the newspaper, the event ended with chants of "Long live Armenia, long live Boğaz Mubar," for example, and "Long live the British Empire." Also, Armenian clergy, Armenian church also supported this idea. So it was not only by political figures, political parties, such as Tashnaks, Ramgavars, or other Hınçaks, but also the Armenian clergy and patriarchate also showed support for this Armenian independence idea at that time. By the way, it's very interesting to see that all of the Armenian political parties came together for this political goal, because I think in the Armenian history, it's very surprising to see that all of these political parties come together for an idea. Normally, they don't like each other, and they're always in fight to gain some political goals. So what happened then? We have the emergence of Turkish national movement by Mustafa Kemal in May 1919. It is very important because with the movement of Mustafa Kemal, Armenians started to lose this political fight in the field against, with the allied powers. So when Mustafa Kemal landed in Samsun in May 1919, the Ottoman lands were already occupied by the Greeks. Greeks occupied Izmir, British occupied Urfa, Maraş, and Cilicia area, and then French forces occupied also Cilicia area. But the first target of the Turkish national movement was actually the tiny Armenian state, which was established in 1918. So their first target was the Armenian state, not the Greeks, not the French, not the British. And we see this Turkish-Armenian war in the Caucasus at the beginning of 1920, which is, I think, very important. But I'm not going to talk about the details of this war, but rather than what is important for the main theme and discussion of this lecture is the support of Ottoman Armenians shown to the Republic of Armenia. So Armenians living in the Ottoman Empire, they didn't support the Kemalist movement, national forces, but they supported and organized donation campaigns for the Republic of Armenia at that time, because they saw the Republic of Armenia as the nucleus of the United Armenian State. So that's why they supported and organized donation campaigns for the Republic of Armenia. In different districts of Istanbul, Armenian teachers and students participated in the campaign. Armenian Patriarchate also participated in these donation campaigns. Armenian Patriarchate in Istanbul, by the way, participated in these donation campaigns. For instance, in an Armenian school in Makriköy district of Istanbul, the Armenian orphans asked the director to donate the whole volume of 1 month's food to the Armenian military, choosing to eat only dry bread. The director refused on the grounds that they should eat properly for their health, and donated a significant amount to the military, Armenian military, on behalf of the Armenian orphans. It's an interesting story because a few days later, the Armenian orphans collected the cheese that they were given for breakfast. And one of the orphans attempted to sell this cheese in Makriköy shops in order to donate the income to the Armenian military. Similarly, another Armenian school, Aramian Unjian School in Istanbul, also organized donation campaigns for the Armenian military in the Caucasus. Not only in Istanbul, but Armenians in the remote parts of Anatolia, who were also, genocide survivors, they also engaged in donation campaigns. For example, Armenians of Biga, a small town in Çanakkale, organized a fundraising campaign for the Armenian military, collecting 500 Ottoman liras. After the fall of Kars and Gümrü and the defeat of the Armenian forces by the Turkish nationalist movement, the Armenian community in Bursa declared a state of mourning. No Armenian in the city opened his shops on that day, and a religious rite was held in the Armenian church. As you may know, the French forces occupied some parts of southern Ottoman Empire, southern Anatolia at that time. They occupied the Cilicia region. And for my discussion, I see that there is another indicator of pro-independence approach of Armenians regarding the French occupation of the Cilicia region, because French forces and French authorities actually encouraged Armenian survivors to return to these lands in this Cilicia, in Cilicia region, such as Adana, Maraş, Antep, Cebeli Bereket, and other regions, Mersin, for example. So the Armenian survivors who were in northern parts of Syria actually returned with the help of French forces and French authorities. And the Armenian Legion actually was organized to help French occupational forces. Many Armenians volunteered for the French military at that time, and they started to fight against the Turkish national movement. We have a few statements from French authorities who openly declared that they wanted to see an independent Armenian state in the Cilicia region. For example, as you can see in this image from an Ottoman Turkey, from an Armenian daily, from Vercinur daily, they celebrated national days of France, and they were very supporting French occupational forces. Even though French authorities made statements supporting the idea of establishing an Armenian state, they anticipated that they would face difficulties in collecting its loans from the Ottoman government. At the beginning of war, French capital investments constitute 60% of total capital investments in the Ottoman Empire, whereas German and British capital investments were only 25% and 14% respectively. Motivated to protect their French investments, the French authorities significantly changed their discourses by the beginning of 1920 in recognizing Mustafa Kemal's movement as the most powerful development in Anatolia. The French authorities adopted their policy to find more common ground with the Turkish national movement. So, in response to these French political endeavors, actually in August 1920, the representative of Greeks, Assyrians, Chaldeans, and Armenians, they together selected representatives and they declared an independent Christian state in Cilicia. But it lasted only 2 days because the French authorities refused to accept this political endeavor, and they agreed with the Turkish national movement, and they stopped the movement of Armenians. So Armenians were very, they were disappointed with the attitude of French. And for example, Dikran Küpelyan, an Armenian lawyer, a prominent member of the Cilician Armenian community, he wrote an article and he expressed the feelings of Armenians against French authorities. Had it not been for the so-called defender Francis Ban, the Christian population of Cilicia would have already won their case. Yes, remaining in Cilicia was an evil, but leaving it was lesser evil. If we had stayed there, no matter what, our safety would be temporary, and most probably we would all have lost our lives. But by leaving the state alive, even though poor and miserable, we are still full of hope that one day we will return to our lands. Many of these Armenian genocide survivors who were able to return in 1918 to the Cilicia region were forced to leave again, and they left for northern Syria, Cyprus, and Greece. The majority left for Greece and also Izmir and Istanbul, which were under Allied control at that time by the beginning of 1920. So 3 important military events initiated a state of flight for the Armenian survivors. First, the evacuation of Cilicia by the French forces. Second, the defeat of Armenian state against the Turkish national movement. And third, the defeat of Greek forces by the Turkish nationalists. At that time, in 1921 and 1922, the Turkish national movement, troops of Mustafa Kemal, also defeated the Greeks, and they forced Greeks, to evacuate the region, and the Greek forces left Izmir and surrounding area. So many Armenians also in that area forced to move Greece and Cyprus at that time. Following these 3 events, almost half of the entire remaining Armenians fled from Anatolia and Istanbul, which were now becoming under control of the Republic of Turkey. About 150,000 Armenians fled to Greece. More than 200,000 Armenians fled to Syria and Lebanon. By the beginning of the Lausanne Conference, the Armenian community in the Ottoman Empire forcefully transformed into an isolated ethnic minority group, mainly concentrated in Istanbul. So we see a very interesting endeavor by the remaining Armenians in Istanbul at that time, because the same intellectuals and the same Armenian newspapers, they started to publish articles and editorials about Turkish-Armenian friendship. So during, as I mentioned, before 1922, they supported the idea of Armenian independence. But after seeing that, after seeing the evacuation of Cilicia by the French and the defeat of Armenians in the Caucasus, the remaining Armenian community tried to find, common ground with the Turkish national movement. So the beginning of Lausanne Conference was very important at that time, because Lausanne Conference opened in November 1922 with the participation of British, French, Italian, and Turkish representatives. in what amounted to a blow from the Entente Allied powers, Armenian politicians were not invited to participate in this important conference in Lausanne, even though Armenians, established these volunteer troops to fight with French and the British. They were not invited to participate in the Lausanne conference. The Armenian committee representing the Ottoman Armenians at Lausanne, actually, a group of Armenians went to Lausanne and they wanted to present their, they wanted to present their situation, and they asked for an Armenian national home to be established in Turkey to relocate these Armenian survivors to that region. They actually asked the Cebeli Bereket region, which is Antakya and Hatay today, and also they asked Kars, Ardahan, and Batum area for these Armenian survivors, but the Turkish authorities strongly refused the idea, and also Allied powers they showed no support for the Armenians. So we have the establishment of Turkish-Armenian Friendship Association here. I think this is important to see the political change of Armenians at that time, the political change of community at that time. Armenians who stayed within the borders of newly established Turkey, they embarked upon new initiatives. Turkish-Armenian Friendship Association was established by a group of Armenians in Istanbul towards the end of 1922, with the aim of re-establishing friendship between two communities. For example, they organized a tea event, tea gathering in Istanbul. Armenians and Turks, Armenians and mainly Turkish intellectuals. You can see the Turkish flag in the background and the portrait of also an image of Mustafa Kemal there and the Turkish flags. They organized these gatherings with Turkish politicians and the member, the representative of our representative of Armenians, Haruki Mostichyan, took the floor. I quote, "Turks and Armenians were two nations like flesh and name, but unfortunately some agonizing events created coldness between them. All Armenians wish to help that coldness evaporate, and we hope that Turks also wish the same, because they are our big brothers. However, the efforts of this association alone are not enough. The press should also bring its contribution to long live Turkey, long live the fatherland, long live the blood brothers of this fatherland." You see within only just 2 years, the political position of the community changed from pro-independence to pro-Turkish approach. So Mostichyan's proclamations marked a turning point. Two primary factors were responsible for this change. First, after the disappointments of Allied powers during the Turkish-Armenian War in the Caucasus and French occupation in Cilicia, the Armenians living in Istanbul and Anatolia began to think that there was no advantage to taking pro-Entente, pro-Allied position, but they would only find pain, economic breakdown, and political turmoil in which many more Armenians would lose their lives. Therefore, the sole viable solution appeared to be becoming friends with the Turks, expressing their loyalty. The second reason was economic interest, because many Armenians living in Istanbul were not deported during the wartime, and they were able to keep their businesses open through the Armistice years. The bulk of Armenian businessmen were aware of the fact that Armenian refugees in Greece, Syria, Armenia, and other countries did not live in prosperity. Therefore, they decided in self-interest not to disturb peace, and these two reasons actually motivated the remaining Armenian population in Istanbul to join activities of Turkish-Armenian Friendship Association. So when İsmet Pasha and the delegates who attended Lausanne conference on behalf of the Turkish government returned Turkey in 1923, prominent members of Armenian community in Istanbul, including the patriarchal local tenants, Kevork Aslanyan, Haruki Mostichyan, the president of the community, and other prominent members, they welcomed the Turkish delegation and they congratulated them for their agreement in Lausanne. In his speech before İsmet Pasha, I quote, Mostichyan said that, I quote, as stated before on different occasions, the Armenians of Turkey linked their fate to the fate of the Turks. They do not expect anything from anyone. They want to stay with the Turks by preserving centuries of old friendship and advance this precious country by working together with their compatriots. So Armenian community awarded a gold medal to Ismet Pasha for his efforts. You can see the gold medal on the right. And Ottoman Turkish newspapers, they published articles about this attitude of Armenian community at that time. For example, during the speech of Armenian delegation, the Turkish members in the hall ridiculed and laughed at the presentation of Armenian members because they knew what Armenian community pursued during the Armistice years before 1922. This was also a turning point in inter-Armenian relations because those Armenians who remained in Turkey were isolated, and those Armenians who settled in Europe, Middle East, and the United States, they established the Armenian diaspora. So these relations between Western Armenians also changed after that. Armenians in Istanbul, showed this pro-Turkish approach at that time. The end of the Ottoman Empire also signaled the end of the Western Armenian life in Anatolia. Following the First World War, the genocide and the subsequent evacuations of Cilicia, Izmir, and the South Marmara regions during the Armistice period, the villages, towns, and cities of Anatolia suffered the loss of majority of their Armenian inhabitants. Those Armenians who survived remained in Istanbul and Anatolia, forged new paths through this political turmoil, living as Turkish Armenians. While the Armenian community was at the whim of political winds, forced to accommodate the Turkish state's oppressive policies after the Allied withdrawal, it endured the shifts in position and rhetoric. Following the Young Turks' attempted existential erasure, thus the Armenian genocide of 1915, the resultant diaspora dispersed to all corners of the globe, thus ensuring the safety and preservation of Western Armenian language, literature, culture, and also identity. Thank you for your patience.
Right. So thank you very much for this talk. We have, what do we have? We have a good half hour actually for discussion. Would you like to take your own question? What would you like to do? Would you like to take your own question? Should I moderate? What would you like to do? Should I keep track of who's asking what? And we have people online as well. I'm not sure. What are the Q&As? They've been there forever. I think they're asking.
These are people telling me
the sound is not great. Okay, great. So, I'll just stand here and try and keep track of whoever wants to. Go ahead.
You mentioned external factors that motivated the Allied powers to support the self-determination of Armenia in 1918.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering what was the motivation behind that for the Allied powers, and what changed in the early 1920s when they changed their stance, and also as like a supplement to that. Other than like Turkish interests, what allowed for the Treaty of Lausanne to replace the Treaty of Sevres, which was more aligned with Armenian interests?
Thank you for this good question. So, Allied powers, mainly French authorities, saw these Armenian survivors as an opportunity to help their endeavor in occupying Cilicia region and the Ottoman lands. So basically, the French forces and French authorities encouraged Armenians to relocate to these lands, to repopulate the region, and create a balance between Muslims and non-Muslims and Christians in the Cilicia region. So that's why it was important for the French to gain support of Armenian survivors at that time in 1918 and 1919. But as I mentioned, after the emergence of Turkish national movement by Mustafa Kemal, they changed this attitude because they understood that Mustafa Kemal's movement was actually the most powerful movement among people, among Muslims in Anatolia, but not the Ottoman Sultanate, Sultan in capital Istanbul at that time. So they chose between the Ottoman government in Istanbul and the newly established Turkish government in Ankara, and they find a way to find a common ground with this Turkish national movement. And once they agreed with Turkish national movement, the Armenian, survivors lost its, value in the eyes of French, and they even did not provide assistance to these Armenian survivors to leave, to evacuate that region. French authorities, they blocked this, the location of Armenians to Syria and Lebanon at that time. But then we know that, that we have Armenian diaspora in Lebanon and Syria today. Between Lausanne Conference and Treaty of Sèvres, I think Turkish national movement again played an important role from changing from Treaty of Sèvres to Treaty of Lausanne, and I think the Turkish national movement, they also were very powerful in this diplomatic field to convince allied powers during the Lausanne Conference. They even blocked the attendance of Armenians to Lausanne Conference at that time.
Thank you, Dr. Şekeryan. This is a very important. My question is, in the 1920, when the Turkish Armenian Friendship Association organizations of that nature started appearing, 1922, yeah, sorry, and I think it was Mostijan and whatever. As they were saying these kind of forgiving and kind of rejoining statements, did that represent the sentiment of Istanbul Armenians at the time, or was it more of a political move?
I think the majority. I mean, we cannot say that all Armenians in Istanbul supported this idea of Turkish-Armenian Friendship Association, but the majority of the community, when I say majority, I look at the community leadership, such as the Armenian Patriarchate, members of the Civic Council of the Armenian community in Istanbul, leading Armenian intellectuals in Istanbul, what they wrote about this friendship association. And I can say that the majority of the community supported the idea at that time. Those who didn't support actually left Istanbul in 1922, because half of the Armenian population left Istanbul in 1922 because they feared, that this Turkish national movement could cause harm to the Armenian population in Istanbul as well. So many, many Armenian politicians and community members, especially Dashnaks and other political groups, they left Istanbul. They left for Greece, Syria, Lebanon, and other countries. So the remaining Armenian population, Armenian community, in 1922 were they didn't want to involve in politics, so they wanted to stay in Istanbul. And the only way to stay in Istanbul was to change this political position and support the activities of this Turkish Armenian Friendship Association.
So can I do a follow-up question to Armin's question? Basically, it's the same question, but in reverse. I spent a lot of my students are here, and I spent a lot of time trying to tell them that there's no such thing as an Armenian community and anything, right? Like nothing is monolithic, right? So it's in the first part of your talk, where you're talking about nationalism as the only option during the period of occupation of Istanbul, it sounded that way. It sounded like there was one community. They all wanted to have a separatist nationalism as the only option, and they went for it until they were not able to go for it.
Yeah.
I'm hoping you can complicate this a little bit for us. Not everybody went, there's no such thing as everybody doing everything at the same time, right? So can you give us a sense of, were there other ideas other than just separatist nationalism?
Yeah, I know that it's risky to say that, you know, all Armenians supported this idea of nationalism and independence. But what I found in Armenian newspapers, Armenian publications, that all of Armenian, let's say, political groups supported this idea of Armenian state. Especially, you know, I checked, you know, publications of Tashnaks, publications of Ramgavars, Himchaks, and other groups, Armenian Patriarchate, other civic council members. They all published, you know, declarations to support the idea of this Armenian state. I couldn't find any article writing about, you know, look, we are, you know, citizens of Ottoman Empire. Let's stay calm, etc. They were all supporting this idea, and I know that it's not right to say the whole Armenians. That's why I always use the majority of Armenians, because we don't know. Maybe, of course, there were people, you know, supporting the Ottoman state. Maybe people supporting the Turkish national movement at that time. But what is interesting is that people who established this Turkish-Armenian Friendship Association, the same members, a few years before, they donated certain amounts of money for the Republic of Armenia. So these people that discuss about Turkish-Armenian friendship in 1922 actually sent donations to the Republic of Armenia 2 years before, in 1920. So they were the same members. For example, Berç Keresteciyan, one of the leading members of Turkish-Armenian Friendship Association. I found that in 1920, he actually donated a great amount of money for these donation campaigns for the Republic of Armenia. And he published an article asking what happened to our money, what happened to my money that I sent to the Republic of Armenia in 1920. But 2 years later, we see that he was the leading member of this Turkish-Armenian Friendship Association. So we have this, you know,
survival.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Survival.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if this has fallen under the research you've done, but I'm just curious if you've come across anything on the relationship between Armenians within the borders of the new Turkey and Kurds, since, you know, after a very, very fraught point in history, they now find themselves on the same side of a minority versus Turkish majority divide, and also have potentially overlapping claims to autonomous zones within the new Turkish state.
Yeah, that's a very good question, but let me try to answer. The Kurds at that time, you know, great part of Kurds actually supported Kemalist Turkish national movement. So there were, you know, there were certain groups that established a society to create a Kurdistan in that region, in Eastern Anatolia. But at that time, as I mentioned, Armenians were also making claims for the same lands. So that's why I didn't see any alliance or friendship between Armenians and Kurds at that time. As I mentioned, half of Armenians, maybe half of Kurds, they supported the Turkish national movement, and the other half, you know, created this society, Kurdish society, Kurdistan Teali Cemiyeti, I guess, Kurdish Enhancement Society, like that, to discuss about the idea of self-determination. And they tried to send delegates to Paris conference at that time, but they were also not successful.
There's a couple. You can see them. There's a couple of questions. Do you want me to read them out loud?
No,
You can read them?
Yeah.
So the first, well, yeah, it's up to you what you want to answer or not. The first one is outside of your talk. This is closer to what you just said, but go ahead.
So the first question
From Armen
online.
online.
Thank you, Armen. Do you know Armenians? Do you know if Armenians? Yes. Yeah. I have seen a couple of articles. I didn't discuss this in my book, but I have seen a couple of articles published at that time in 1919 that Armenians constructed a monument in Taksim Square, actually in Gezi Park, today's modern day Gezi Park, to commemorate the Armenian genocide of 1915.
Sorry, we have to read the question because people online actually cannot see this screen.
Oh, really?
So do you mind reading this? I'll read this. Like, many of your sources seem to come from newspapers, that is, sources intended for public consumption. Do you think our understanding of this period would change much if we were to look at archival sources?
Yes, that's possible, but I don't think. I mean, what archival sources from? If you meant the Ottoman archival sources, I don't think that we can find such information from Ottoman archives at that time. Maybe regarding diplomatic history. Yes, regarding diplomatic history, we can write differently if we use archival sources, but I don't think that we can find information about these political activities of the Armenian community in the Ottoman archival sources. So that's why I use Armenian newspapers and Armenian newspapers and some testimonies and oral histories about this period.
The second question is from Javad, and then we'll come back to the room live. Sorry. Javad says, thank you for the great talk. Was there any interaction between Armenian and Kurdish leaders or intellectuals before and during the Lausanne Treaty and the Paris Conference?
That's a very good question. I haven't seen any relationship between Armenian and Kurdish leaders inside Republic of Turkey or Ottoman Empire at that time. But I think Armenians and Kurdish leaders outside of Turkey made some attempts to express their goals in Lausanne Conference. For example, Kapriyan Noradunkian and for example, tried to participate in Lausanne Conference to ask for this Armenian national home. And I know that they collaborated or they got into touch with Kurdish leaders in Iraq and Syria. But I think we need further research. As far as I know, in 1925, for example, Kurdish leaders inside Turkey got into touch with Armenian Taşnak Sütun party during the first decades of Republic of Turkey, but we need further research.
Thank you. Okay, back to the room. I've been looking at you for a while. I'll come back to you as well. Go ahead.
Well, I'll ask my question as an Armenian student and as a survival of Armenian genocide, survival of descendant of Armenian genocide. I'll take the responsibility on behalf of all Armenian students to say thank you for bringing our attention to this important topic.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, my question is, you said towards more, as you mentioned during your lecture, towards 1923, there was more pro-Turkish movement amongst Armenians amongst Armenian in Turkey. I just want to know what was the general opinion of Armenians already newly established in Eastern Armenia, which was already the part of Soviet Union at that time. What was the general opinion of Armenians in Eastern Armenia regarding this pro-Turkish movement?
Yeah, I think they supported this idea because it was not an independent Armenian state at that time. They were living in, under the control of Soviets at the time, Bolsheviks. So, and the relations between Bolsheviks and the Turkish national movement, the newly established Republic of Turkey, was so good at that time. Bolsheviks sent many aid, military and monetary aid to Turkey. So that's why I didn't check the publications that Armenian publications that published in Yerevan or Republic of Armenia at the time. But I assume that they were supportive of the Armenian community in Istanbul, because Armenian community in Istanbul were trying to find a common ground with the newly established Republic of Turkey, right? That's why they supported the idea of this improving relations between Armenians, Turkey, and Bolsheviks.
Thank you for the talk. So my question is regarding how the common Turkish people were reacting to Armenians' friendship movements, and were the opinions of the common Turkish aligned with the leaders of the Turkish, the Turkish community?
Yeah, I think they were supportive of this initiative because the Republic of Turkey, when we look at the first decade of the Republic of Turkey, we see many repressive policies against the Armenian community in Istanbul. They were forced to, accept this Turkish, let's say, superiority against Armenians. They were forced to, declare that they were loyal citizens of Republic of Turkey during the first decade of Republic of Turkey. And contrary to the agreement that they made at Lausanne Conference, the Turkish government actually employed more repressive policies against Armenians. They tried to close Armenian language schools at that time. They tried to forbid speaking Armenian in public space. But for the ordinary people, I didn't do research. Actually, we cannot do research about finding out what ordinary people think. But their representatives supported this idea of Turkish Armenian friendship.
Sorry.
Thank you very much for your talk. Could you talk a little bit more about the everyday life and the professional life of Istanbul Armenians who were supportive of the Turkish Armenian Friendship Association? I know that because of the Ottoman professionalization system, a lot of photographers and architects were Armenians in Istanbul. And so I'm guessing that there were, I don't know how many of them were supportive, but I'm trying to imagine the kind of mood or psychology that would push some Istanbul Armenians to support the Turkish Republic. Did they think that their professional life would not be affected and their resources would not be depleted? What do you think how is the everyday life and the professional, professionalization of that community?
The bulk of the majority of Armenian members within this Turkish Armenian Friendship Association was from business background. So they were businessmen in Istanbul who were not deported during the wartime, because as you may know, Armenians in Istanbul were not deported. Only the Armenian intellectuals in Istanbul were arrested and they were killed. But people like Armenian community in Istanbul stayed in Istanbul during the wartime. And from my research, I can say that the majority of these members were businessmen who kept open their businesses during wartime. And they actually didn't want to destroy their peace that they had in Istanbul at that time. That's why they supported this idea of Turkish-Armenian friendship. And the situation of Armenian survivors was so bad in Syria, Lebanon, in Greece. The conditions were terrible at that time. Only nearest relief, American nearest relief, provided help for these refugees. So basically, Istanbul Armenians didn't want to be refugee in Syria, in Greece, and Republic of Armenia.
You say a little something about how, a little bit about how Operation Nemesis reverberated in the news media among Armenian, in the Armenian press that you're looking at. I mean, again, looking for the cracks, you know, so how does the Dash Constitution and its activity, the assassination of Talat Pasha, do the Armenian groups that are supporting the friendship approach having to kind of respond to that in some way? Does it challenge that platform?
That's a very good question and a topic to write about, a journal article. I haven't seen any publications about Operation Nemesis, any responses to the Operation Nemesis at the time.
No reaction in 1921.
No. That's a very good question that I need to do more research for that particular period to find out what Armenian intellectuals wrote about Operation Nemesis.
I'm going to ask a question that a really good student of mine asked me today while we're discussing Lerna Ekmekcioglu's book in preparation for this talk. And I wasn't sure I gave him the right answer, but so I want to get your thought on this. He was asking me, after everything that has happened, why would any Armenians want to stay in Istanbul if they have the means to leave? Why would they stay and take on Turkish nationality and declare their allegiance to Turkey? And a lot of them still live there, right? So why? I had my answer and sense of belonging, and of course, claiming the land, the resistance, you know, existence is. I gave him everything that I had in my bag, but it wasn't quite satisfactory. So I thought I would pose that question to you.
I think there were different motivations because, first of all, it was not cheap to get tickets to leave from Istanbul to United States and Europe and other countries. It was very expensive. First of all, you know, some, let's say, families couldn't find means to leave Istanbul. Also, to get necessary documentation to leave Istanbul. So that's why, because of this, you know, very practical, practical reasons, like not getting necessary documents and also, you know, economic means, they stayed in Istanbul. This was a certain group. And there were also, like I mentioned, wealthy Armenian businessmen in Istanbul whose families were not affected by the Armenian genocide because their family members were in Istanbul at that time. They were not affected by the Armenian genocide of 1915. They kept their businesses open. They were, you know, making money at that time. So they just wanted to stay in Istanbul. They didn't see any reason to leave Istanbul. This was another group within the Armenian community. But as far as I can say that perhaps more than half of the Armenian population in Istanbul left in 1922. So perhaps from 200 to 250,000, the population decreased to 100, 150,000 at that time, especially those Armenians who were very active in 1920s, 1921 against the Turkish national movement. They left. They left to become refugees in Greece, in Syria, Lebanon. Some were able to go Europe and United States as well.
Thank you. Any questions?
Just a quick
Yeah,
follow-up
please.
on that. I know this is outside the period of your book, but do you see more migration to the Republic of Armenia after, say, the Stalinist period, or after conditions improve?
The Armenian repatriation
From
in
Turkey.
1940s after the Second World War.
From Turkey specifically.
Yeah, from Turkey. Actually, my family left to Republic of Armenia at that time, from Istanbul to Republic of Armenia within this Armenian repatriation movement. They left directly from Sivas to Republic of Armenia, but they spent only 2 years because of these differences between Western Armenians and Eastern Armenians. Armenians in Republic of Armenia, they were telling that my family was third, because they were speaking Turkish, differences between Western and Eastern Armenians. But as far as I know, there was a movement to repatriate Soviet Armenian at that time, also in Turkey, within Turkish Armenian communities in Istanbul or remote parts of Anatolia, and also Greece. Many Armenian refugees in Greece repatriated to the Soviet Armenia towards the end of 1920s, 30s, and after the Second World War. I have seen many survival testimonies who were in Greece and left for Republic of Armenia, Soviet Armenia at that time, because the Greek government actually didn't want after some point in 1920s, towards the end of 1920s, the Greek government made requests to League of Nations to basically get rid of from these Armenian refugees. And they asked League of Nations, not United Nations at the time, they asked League of Nations to find a place for the Armenian refugees who were living in Greece. There were around 200,000 Armenian genocide survivors in Greece at that time. And I know that many of them chose to migrate to Soviet Armenia.
Wonderful. So we're right at 6 o'clock. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Dr.